people. In a statement you made on July 3rd, 2025, after the passage of the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill, you said that the legislation would unleash growth in the American economy. Republicans pledged that it would stimulate economic growth and lead to an additional $2.4 trillion in government revenue. However, the most recent GDP data shows that the economy barely grew in the last quarter of 2025 at a rate of only 0.5% and continues to fall below expectations in the first quarter of 2026. Time and time again, you told the American people not to believe their own eyes or what's in their bank accounts. While families have been hit with higher costs from Trump's illegal tariffs and his costly war on a war of choice in Iran, this administration continues to insist that the economy is thriving. The reality, sir, especially for the folks that I represent in Alabama, is that you forecast a 5.4% growth in GDP for the fourth quarter 2025 and only delivered a 0.5% growth. The reality is that wages have fallen behind rising inflation and that job growth dramatically slowed down since Trump took office. Mr. Secretary, I'm asking you rhetorically the following questions. I ask you, why was your analysis so wrong? And I'm asking you rhetorically, since you've shown yourself not to be able to answer questions on this side. So let me try to answer it. Could it be that Trump's illegal tariff or the cost of the war of choice in Iran were the reasons why your analysis was off? Whatever the reason, I want you to know that the people that I represent in Alabama are hurting under this economy. Prices in Alabama have fallen by 3.6% over last year. Energy prices are up 18%, and exports of Alabama products and services have dropped by $3 billion since President Trump took office. In addition, the Iran war has cost American households over $100 billion. Grocery prices are rising faster than any time in the last 4 years, and gas is over $4 a gallon in Alabama.
Wednesday says one number. Thursday, the government's own data tells a different story. On Wednesday, June 4, 2026, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said at a cabinet meeting, real GDP has increased by 2.7% over the last 4 quarters, and he added, Atlanta Fed GDPNow is forecasting 4.3% for this quarter. The next day, the Commerce Department released the official figures. In the fourth quarter of 2025, GDP had grown by just 0.5%. This was a quarter overshadowed by the government shutdown, and the initial estimate for the first quarter of 2026 was 2%, which was later revised down. Alabama Representative Terri Sewell sat directly across from Bessent in the House Budget and Ways Committee the same week, and in her hand she had an official document published by Bessent's own Treasury Department. If you want to see these kinds of facts with this clarity, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Let's return to the stage. Official figures from 0.5% to 1.6%. To understand the root of this crisis, one needs to know the true trajectory of GDP data. Throughout 2025, as the U.S. economy struggled, Republican officials repeatedly insisted that good news was on the way and that Americans would not have to wait long to see satisfactory results. Just last August, for example, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent predicted to a national television audience that the U.S. economy would really gain momentum in the fourth quarter of 2025. It did not gain momentum in the fourth quarter of 2025. The Commerce Department released the official figures. In the fourth quarter of 2025, GDP had grown by just 0.5%. This was a quarter overshadowed by the government shutdown, and the initial estimate for the first quarter of 2026 was 2%, which was later revised down. New government data released on Thursday showed that the U.S. economy grew more slowly than previously expected in the first quarter of 2026. The Commerce Department revised its GDP estimate for the January to March period, finding that the economy grew at a 1.6% annual rate, adjusted for inflation and seasonal variations during that period. This was a dramatic downward revision from a previous estimate of 2% growth in the first quarter. Bessent's Wednesday statement, selective numbers. The power of Bessent's remarks at the cabinet meeting lay in which numbers he chose. On Wednesday, during a cabinet meeting, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent highlighted U.S. GDP growth and quoted a series of figures. Real GDP has increased by 2.7% over the last 4 quarters, Bessent said, adding Atlanta Fed GDPNow is forecasting 4.3% for this quarter. These two figures seem to be carefully selected. The average of the last 4 quarters and the forward-looking forecast were emphasized. However, the main indicator that should have been included between these two data points, namely the low growth rate of 0.5% recorded in the fourth quarter of 2025, was not mentioned at all. However, this assessment had to be reconsidered when Bessent attended the press briefing held at the White House the following Thursday afternoon. Complicating a favorite talking point, media reactions summarized the political impact of this figure's contradiction. CNN's news headline, "Downward GDP Revision Complicates White House Favorite Talking Point." The White House continues to claim that the U.S. economy is healthy and growing, but 2 quarters of weak growth complicate this narrative. The change necessitated an immediate adjustment in the White House messaging when the figures released on Wednesday were revised. This is an extremely important observation. Bessent's talk on Wednesday was based on a still unrevised, more optimistic dataset. The next day's correction undermined the foundation of that speech. Sewell's interrogation, putting their own document on the table. Sewell's strategy aligns with the classic technique we saw in the Larson and Doggett interrogations, using the other party's own document against their own authority. In the Treasury Department's own official statement, the following sentence was included. Real GDP growth accelerated to an annual rate of 2.0% in the first quarter of 2026, rebounding from the 0.5% growth at the end of 2025. This sentence clearly acknowledged the low growth of 0.5% in the Treasury Department's own document, and this admission did not align with Bessent's last 4 quarters average framework at the cabinet meeting, because average-based figures could obscure the weakest quarter within them. Something in front of 3 Bessent's subsequent comments. In the wake of this crisis, Bessent's comments on growth targets also showed a noteworthy inconsistency. Bessent said GDP growth was around 4% at the beginning of the year, slowed down, and could return to something with a 3 in front of it. The actual numbers show Q3 2025 at 4.4%, Q4 at 0.5%, and Q1 at 2.6%. When these 3 figures are placed next to each other, the story of stable high growth being told contradicts a much more volatile reality, a drop from 4.4% to 0.5%, followed by a partial recovery. Bessent's argument ultimately rests on the idea that a productivity boost could allow the economy to expand more quickly without the inflation that normally comes with strong growth. The challenge is that the data looks promising, but it hasn't been fully validated yet. Inflation remains above the Fed's target, service prices continue to be hot, and economic growth has been uneven quarter to quarter. Mottoblog's historical observation, repeated false predictions, the assessment that clearly highlights the historical dimension of this crisis came from MSNBC's analysis. Throughout 2025, as the U.S. economy struggled, Republican officials repeatedly insisted that good news was on the way and that Americans would not have to wait long to see satisfactory results. This statement formed a similar pattern to Larson's earlier temporary rhetoric. First, a promise is made, then developments do not validate that promise, and subsequently a new promise is put forth. The decline in economic growth is largely due to the downward revision of expectations for inventory investments, while forecasts for consumer spending in services sector, especially in healthcare, have also been revised down. Treasury's own second quarter statement, favorable landscape. The most ironic aspect of this crisis was the very language used in the Treasury Department's official publication. The economic landscape under the Trump administration is favorable, supported by strong business investment and solid household consumption growth. Moreover, the data for investments, sales, and earnings show that the economy is ready for continued expansion. This statement carries the same optimistic tone as the cabinet presentation on Wednesday, but this framework contradicts the 0.5% low growth admitted elsewhere in the same document. The recovery from the government shutdown and a slower decline in private inventories largely reflected the increase in the first quarter. The shadow of the Iran war, additional pressure for growth. Behind these growth figures, the economic impact of the war was an undeniable factor. Before the war began, consumers were already under pressure. 2025 tariffs continued to be reflected in retail prices, and wage increases were returning to normal after the COVID-19 period surge. An additional tax in the form of higher prices at the pump would lead to a decrease in consumer spending elsewhere. The recent increase in political uncertainty due to the war may prevent companies from ramping up hiring. This could push the unemployment rate higher in the coming months. Even if diplomacy prevails, the negative shock to the economy is already in motion. The spillover effects are likely to extend into the second half of the year, even if a peace agreement is reached in the coming weeks. This assessment shows that the economic cost of the war is not limited to direct expenditures, but also creates indirect pressure on GDP growth. Despite rising price levels associated with the Iran conflict pushing headline inflation, the U.S. economy is more resilient to fluctuations in energy prices thanks to increased U.S. oil production and supply. Bessent's framework continues, new claim in June. The latest evidence of the repeating pattern of this crisis came from another statement at the end of June. On CNBC's Squawk Box, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent argued that the U.S. could achieve 3% GDP growth without reigniting inflation. Bessent's framework is grounded in the real economy. Productivity-focused growth behaves differently than truly demand-focused growth. However, headline PCE hovered around 4% year-on-year in April 2026, while core PCE was around 3%. The Fed's target is 2% annually, and historically, anything above 3% leads policymakers to talk about rate hikes rather than rate cuts. This shows that Bessent has repeated the same optimistic growth story even after the GDP revision crisis. Although the numbers turned out to be more complex than they seemed each time, the overarching narrative remained unchanged. Conclusion: the real story behind the numbers. The picture emerging from this crisis points to a larger accountability question beyond just a GDP statistic. Bessent said on Wednesday the last 4 quarters at 2.7% and this quarter at 4.3%. The next day, official data cut the first quarter estimate from 2% to 1.6%, and behind those numbers was the 0.5% low growth in the fourth quarter of 2025, a number that was clearly acknowledged in Bessent's own Treasury document. Just last August, Bessent predicted to a national television audience that the U.S. economy would really gain momentum. It did not gain momentum in the fourth quarter of 2025. Sewell's interrogation was an attempt to catch this pattern, a minister telling a story that contradicted the official figures published by their own department. The challenge is that the data looks promising, but it hasn't been fully validated yet. And while this verification is awaited, the American public encounters new figures, new revisions, and new explanations every quarter. If you want to follow this kind of analysis, subscribe and don't forget to turn on notifications. See you in the next update.